This program is designed to provide general information with regards to the subject matters covered. This information is given with the understanding that neither the hosts, guests, sponsors, or station are engaged in rendering any specific and personal, medical, financial, legal, counseling, professional service, or any advice. You should seek the services of competent professionals before applying or trying any suggested ideas.
Good morning, truth seekers. We are back with Hit the Road, Jack, Finding the Zodiac, where we are looking for the Zodiac killer across the United States as we follow the footsteps of Jack Terrence. Last week, we started to set up the political happenstances during the time when Jack was born. And of course, I have one last slide to finish that off, and then we'll climb right back into his life again. So we'll get back to the presentation. Basically, the Bush-Farish axis started George Bush's career. After his 1948 graduation from Yale and the Skull and Bones Secret Society, George Bush flew down to Texas on a corporate jet and was employed by his father's Dresser Industries. In a couple of years, he got help from his uncle George Walker Jr. and Farish's British banker friends to set him up in the oil property speculation business. So here we see now a connection between oil and Bush. Soon thereafter, George Bush founded the Zapata Oil Company, which put oil drilling rigs into certain locations of great strategic interest to the Anglo-American intelligence community. Zapata was allegedly a code word used by the same mega bankers describing the first communist revolution, which they had financially backed, as they had done with the Nazis themselves. So 25-year-old Will Farish was personal aide to Zapata chairman George Bush in Bush's unsuccessful 1964 campaign for Senate. Farish used the Auschwitz money to back George Bush financially, investing in Zapata. When Bush was elected to Congress in 1966, Farish joined the Zapata board. When George Bush became U.S. Vice President in 1980, the Farish and Bush family fortunes were again completely secretly commingled. As we will see, the old projects were now being revived and on a breathtaking scale. By 1936, some other happenings during this time frame. Of course, we had Lansky, the mom's accountant, and the CIA headquarters in Miami Beach, Florida. In 1936, Lansky had established gambling operations in Florida, New Orleans, and Cuba. These gambling operations were successful as they were founded upon two innovations. Imagine morals and ethics in gambling. First, Lansky and his connections had the technical expertise to manage them effectively based upon Lansky's knowledge of the true mathematical odds of most popular wagering games. Second, mob connections were used to ensure legal and physical security of their establishments from other crime figures and law enforcement through bribes. There was also an absolute rule of integrity concerning the games and wagers made within their establishments. Lansky's carpet joints in Florida and elsewhere were never clip joints where gamblers were unsure of whether or not the games were rigged against them. Lansky ensured that the staff, the croupiers, and their management actually consisted of men of high integrity. In 1936, Lansky's partner Luciano was sent to prison, and in 1946, Lansky convinced the mafia to place Siegel in charge of Las Vegas and became a major investor in Siegel's Flamingo Hotel. So basically, I have a little bit of the political happenstances. A lot of people look at me like I'm crazy when I'm talking about the mob or the CIA, as if this is some ghost, again, quite like the Zodiac, that just doesn't exist or isn't still around. I just find that they are legalized now with the illegal money that they have made, and in most instances have probably helped to initiate laws that would prevent them from doing things in the future that was illegal. So Bush is going to become one of the major players in the mind of the Zodiac killer. There's a heavy connection to Chicago, Illinois, and Texas, which carries over into numerous states, politicians, and media magnates. We'll see the hands of secret societies, CIA, FBI, underground, organized crime, the mob, the elite, and the murders of a lot of people over the course of 60 years that appear to be a path of destruction, greed, and bulldozing anyone that is in their way. I believe that some of the murders were hits and some were distractions, some were to cover hits and some were to create a patsy. Either way, it is the utmost devious behavior, and this killer wants everyone to know the story. I always like to share the weird happenings. I used to do this with Dennis Kaufman on a constant basis as we worked our way through this case in the first few years. So anytime something strange would happen, we would share that strange phenomena. One of those was a cell phone issue that Dennis and I used to have on a constant basis. Whenever he would contact me and attempt to deliver new information or talk about getting together to go over information, all of a sudden our phones would just start acting up, and we would laugh and joke to each other how we were being listened to. That's the narcissist in us, of course, because nobody was probably listening to us. It just didn't seem to happen to anyone else except for us. There was a time, or every time nearly, that Dennis would contact me with new information in the case, I would seem to get extremely busy in my own business and work that would prevent me from getting back to the Zodiac case. And I also was kind of intrigued about the lack of attention that Dennis Kaufman and Jack Terrence was given when it came to law enforcement. Every time Dennis attempted to take this to law enforcement, whether it was San Francisco Police Department, Sonoma County, Napa Sheriff's Department, I got to witness that firsthand. Nobody seemed to want to give us the time of day, even though we were clearly sitting down in front of them with a complete handwriting comparison that substantiated that Jack should have been looked at. I always have these anonymous helpers who show up and disappear. So the most recent was last Friday after the podcast. I received an email from a Jamie Blank from Imagine Entertainment, which is ran or owned by Ron Howard and Brian Grazer. She asked if I could do an examination on camera of the ciphers compared to a new suspect, somebody I haven't heard of yet. Some gal is claiming her grandfather is the Zodiac killer, and they'd like me to do an examination. I always find it interesting that anyone wants anything done in comparison to the ciphers, because as we can see, it's pretty much copybook form. It's not written naturally. The letter size, again, is a 5x7, which would roughly make the cipher on this particular document about 2 inches by 4 inches. Very, very small, but very, very specific writing intended to be disguised. I responded to Jamie that it was not probative to do an examination of the ciphers, since it was copybook or disguised handwriting. There would not be enough writing there for us to make a comparison, not to mention lots of it is symbols. How do you compare that unless you literally have symbols written by someone else? Either way, I also explained that I was more than happy to do the examination at a cost, since I'm no longer working this case for free, even if it's just to help exculpate somebody or lead them into a better path where they're not disseminating information to the public or making an additional documentary that takes away from or adds to more baloney that America has to try and wade through to figure this out. I did not receive a response from her, which I thought was rather unprofessional, since when I am contacted by somebody professional, an attorney or otherwise, I am generally at least given some type of a response, either thanking me for my time or the information I've given, or no, I do not want your services, is really what I expected to see in Jamie's case, but that didn't happen. Needless to say, here we are on the following Friday, and I've still not received a response from this person. Yesterday, I woke up to an attorney asking me to do an examination of something that is illegal. And the interesting part of it is, of course, he had the disclosure at the bottom stating that I could not speak or talk about the instance. So I'm not allowed to give any specifics. I just know that it is illegal on a federal level for it to even be possessed. So I contacted my attorney to determine whether or not it was something I should get involved with, because half of me really wanted to see it, and the other half of me said, it's a little sketchy, I'm not sure. My attorney said that I could be held liable for aiding and abetting a crime since it was federally illegal to possess. The fact that I would have to have it in my hands in order to examine it for authenticity would have made me an aid to this particular crime. So I responded back to the attorney. I informed him of what I found. And again, no response. So I'm not sure what's going on anymore. People wanted me to do on camera examinations and examinations of illegal things. But those are my interesting to-dos from this last week. Copybook printing has little value in identification, just we discussed. There are traits of the Zodiac killer in some of these letters, so I can at least confirm that the letters that are comparable to the Zodiac handwriting are consistent from the ciphers to the actual letters themselves. So I'm going to conclude that nobody different or no one different had written the ciphers versus the letters. And back into Jack's life. So, as the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression sent most farmers into poverty or eviction, Jack's father was more into bootlegging and less time farming. With more than his fair share of homemade booze available, he became more and more violent. In 1942, Jack, at the age of 14, was present when his father was ran over by a tractor at the age of 33. His father was said to have lived 3 days before finally succumbing to his injuries. Jack didn't tell anyone that he had watched his father roll the tractor over a slope and his father was pinned beneath it, but instead of going for help, Jack walked away. That's kind of saying I think he has a bit of hatred for his father. Jack was forced to leave school in 8th grade to take care of the farm. So he never passed 8th grade, and his military records show that his years of education was 8. He attempted to replace his father with an unnatural love and desire to sleep in the same bed as his mother. When this didn't work out, Jack followed in his father's footsteps and at the age of 14 became a moonshiner and bootlegger as well. He learned to use back roads and to evade law enforcement, as the Zodiac killer was prolific at. Jack left home after his mother asked her brother Chubb to come care for the farm. Jack thought this was his role, but Chubbs had his own plans, so he hit the road via the railway at the age of 15. Jack did what he could do to survive, which included making moonshine, bootlegging, and stealing cars. He smuggled alcohol down the same routes his father had, and when there was nowhere to stay, he made home in caves and hunted in order to eat. Again, Jack, growing up on the farm, meant he was very good at hunting small game, even large game, bisecting, skinning, treating, cooking, all of the above. And this will become the behavior of the Zodiac killer during the 1960s and 70s and others where the caves have been mentioned. I know that I had heard several times in regards to the Zodiac case that there were searches going on in caves. I wasn't really sure what that was about, but then after finding out what Jack had done, it made a little more sense. 1942 to 45, Jack claims in his February 3rd, 1950 separation qualification record from the Army of the United States that he drove a light-duty truck for Lubbock Material Company, Inc. But his stories say something different. So while he's showing that he drove light-duty truck, Jack tells stories of being in 28 different states from the age of 15 to 17, holding miscellaneous handyman jobs, and claimed to have killed in many of those states. I'm not sure if the Lubbock Material Company, I wasn't able to really find any research on this company, who might have owned it, if this was a company that was known for supplying alcohol for bootlegging or what it was. It was just kind of interesting that he claimed to have driven truck for these people at the age of 15. Jack recalls that he ran into officers on one of his bootlegging runs. He remembers that the girl he had with him was killed in crossfire while being chased after Jack broke through a roadblock on the outskirts of Texarkana, which is a central route for bootlegging. And we are going to see some early crimes in Texarkana as well. And the fact that he knows all of these backwoods ways also makes him a very good candidate, because a lot of the cases that I look at, they talk about the roads or the lovers' lanes being off of beaten paths where the individual had to know the area in order to have found somebody there. So we're going to follow Jack through that same type of process. So this whole thing of his girl dying in the middle of a bootlegging run is almost kind of reminiscent of a movie that Brad Pitt played in. And his wife, or then pregnant wife, was shot and killed during a bootlegging run. So that might have been a mimic of something that Jack had done. We see lots of movies that almost appear as though they are the Zodiac or Jack's life, that is made well after the fact. And as I watch them, I can usually take note after note after note in regards to the similarities to Jack Terrence and his life. Even though Jack got away in this particular instance of bootlegging, Dennis believes that he held the police responsible for his first and only real love outside of his mother at that point in his life. So this is the only girl that Dennis ever saw Jack get teary-eyed over, and I don't imagine that Jack gets teary-eyed very often. From this point on, Jack wanted revenge, and he believed that he was better, smarter, and faster than the police, which made him untouchable and untraceable. Quoting Stephen Dewhurst, he wrote a book. He had rights from Dennis. Again, Stephen Dewhurst was somebody who stepped into Dennis's life long enough to abscond with evidence, didn't return some of that evidence, proclaiming that he was going to keep and use it for his book that he had paid Dennis money for in order to have the rights to write that book. I don't know that that necessarily gave him the right to keep the evidence that Dennis had in process, but he was in possession of some rolls of film that we found in Jack's stuff. And Stephen Dewhurst was given half the rolls and the FBI was given the other half. Unfortunately, the half that the FBI processed really showed a bunch of people, kids, families playing, things going on, and none of those people were recognizable by Dennis. He did not know anybody on that film, so we don't know why that was in Jack's possession to begin with. So as to quote Stephen Dewhurst, he said, he was probably murdering people before the age of 17. That is a possibility, using methods that would echo eerily decades later in California. Mr. Dewhurst doesn't know how true his statement really is. The first murder that we're going to cover that I believe has a possibility of having a similar MO as the serial killings begins in 1943, which would put Jack at approximately 15, 16 years of age. Jack was on his own from 1942 to 45. He traveled either by stolen car or railway, traveling from farm to farm, offering himself as a farmhand in exchange for room and board. But this boarder had more on his mind than food. Jack can be heard on a cassette tape confessing to the killing of a herd of hogs at one of the ranches that he was on, while the farm owners were gone to town. Jack exclaimed, "I will tell you a good one. I was in New Mexico at the time, and I was about 16 years old. And I was working on this hog farm, and I would go to slop them and they would knock me down and everything else. Well, the people were gone on Sunday, and I said, I will fix you sons of bitches. So I hooked a hot wire of electricity to their trough. Then I hooked a ground wire to a stake I drove into the ground. I then put in the slop and I plugged it in. There was about 50 hogs that just fell over dead, and I wasn't there when the people got home." And he said this with a really eerie chuckle. I'm hoping to be able to actually play that for everyone at some point in time. Dennis did actually make his own DVD, and I believe that's where the voices are that we will hear from the recordings of Jack that Dennis was taking as they spoke. So I have myself a note on here to check to see if the Texarkana Phantom Starks victim was a hog farm. Not really sure if they were or not, but they are definitely one of the crimes listed in here for Texarkana. So 1943 is where I begin to find the particular unsolved crimes that should be considered as his possible beginnings. All unsolved crimes listed from here on out should be investigated for connections, as the face value of this information suggests it. And the Zodiac killer claims he's responsible for minus 100 plus murders by 1986. Something the FBI and the DOJ determined wasn't need to know for the public. So it was kept from us until Dennis Kaufman found it on the desk of Terrence Pascoe in Terrence Pascoe's home. He is the former handwriting expert that worked the Zodiac killer case with the Department of Justice, and I did confirm the information with Mr. Pascoe myself. So the particular communication is mailed out of Sacramento, and in 1986, Jack was most definitely living in the Sacramento area. He was working, I believe, for Hewlett-Packard as a contract security guard. Mailed to the San Francisco Chronicle. I've concluded that the author is the same by my own examination, so I am just a second opinion at this point with Mr. Pascoe, and the DOJ had confirmed the same. I count over 160 murders, and there may be some listed that he is not responsible for, but until all the cases are cross-connected or ran through a link analysis based on the evidence, I do not believe that it's in anyone's interest to rule out the possibilities of Jack's involvement. Growing up on the farm instilled killing in Jack at an early age, and he could fish, track, and hunt with the best of them. Jack even hunted on Lyndon B. Johnson's ranch and would one day receive an invitation to Johnson's marriage to his wife. So here is the direct link or political connection between Jack and Lyndon B. Johnson. His skills included hunting, killing, skinning, fleshing, tanning, and bisecting of game. I believe this might explain why his first few kills were bisected and drained of blood, as you will hear. A hunter would have to do this to pack and carry the carcass out of the woods or hills, which also makes it easier to move a body if you cut it up and break it down into pieces. Also bringing us back to Jack's statement that the worst things he did, or the meanest things he did, occurred previous to his entry into the military. I believe this, the taking of the bodies to wash basins or the bathtubs would be something normal for Jack to do to clean a kill as well. So with the bootlegging, Jack was clearly involved with underground organized crime, which is probably where he met his handlers and why we hear so much about the perverted and corrupt underground society. Also, the suspect talks about underground in several of the communications where he indicates that some are on public display and some are underground and will never be found. Underground could mean caves as well, so can't rule those out. So in the event anyone believes that what I'm about to say to be an unbelievable feat, just look at the prominent route in the 40s across the U.S. using the famous Route 66 from Chicago to the Los Angeles area. The travel time is approximately 27 hours, and this is something that Jack did on a constant, whether it was by railway or even in the car driving himself. I've seen over the years where he is constantly on some type of a road trip that is many, many miles and many, many hours long. So basically, the quickest route between Los Angeles and Chicago, Illinois, and New York is Route 66. And we do know that Jack and the Zodiac actually wrote a letter that included the Phillips 66 map, which I think was kind of a hint or a clue by the Zodiac. In 1944, we find that Flovis sells the farm and moves to Chicago, Illinois, which means Jack is always returning home wherever she's at. You're going to hear a lot about that too. Every time Jack goes home, or every time I have evidence that Jack goes home to his mom, you will see that he is consistently returning there. So we'll see that move across the United States. And when Jack leaves one state, the murders discontinue there, but then pick up in the state where he happens to be, and vice versa when he comes back. So Jack is quoted as saying that he did some of the mean stuff before he enlisted into the Navy in 1946, as I discussed. And that brings us to our first murder. So on Friday, July 23rd, 1943, 42-year-old Ora Murray from the Fox Hills Golf Course, West Los Angeles. Her nude body was found on La Cienega and Slauson by a groundskeeper or a groundkeeper's son. She had been bludgeoned about the face and body, strangled to death, and dumped in a golf club parking lot after 2 a.m. After a night of drinking and dancing in downtown bars, which tends to be one of the places that the Zodiac even mentions as in regards to being caught or finding people. We will have a lot of convenience stores, bars, these type of areas where he finds his victims. So she was basically in town visiting her sister and her brother-in-law. And at the end of the evening, they had met a tall man named Paul who offered to show Ora and her sister Hollywood after the club. They dropped Ora's sister off, Latana Lenin, because her husband did not want to go. And 8 hours later, Ora's nude body was found. Now, I'm kind of on the fence as to whether or not this man, Paul, who offered to show them Hollywood, was somehow a suspect in this, because I highly doubt he would have taken her sister back to the house to pick up another male to put into the car with them if his intention was to have killed Ora. So there is a good chance that she ended that evening with Paul at some point in time and met up with someone else. I don't believe that Paul is the only likely suspect, since many of the victims went missing after being in the company of someone else when they were last seen. Her dress was wrapped around the body like a sarong. Many of the victims we're going to hear about are wrapped in their own clothing. A white gardenia flower placed under her right shoulder, which they then nicknamed the Magnolia Murders, or basically Magnolia Murders, I believe, was an actual movie at the time. Or I'm sorry, they nicknamed the killer the Magnolia Murderer, copycat of the White Rose Murders, written by Cornell Woolrich, a Pulp Fiction writer, and a CBS suspense thriller theater dramatization that first aired on June 6, 1943, just 20 days before this particular killing. I was told there was also a tinsel that was found inside of the magnolia that was underneath the body. There's a media connection like the Chicago Tribune, where we will find a heavy reference or use of the media, newspapers, movies, books, and poetic style in all crimes. The 1945 lipstick killer's first two victims' age range was approximately 33 and 43. So my thought about this is that Jack was shooting for older women at this point as an easier prey. On July 4th, 1968, the Zodiac Blue Rock Springs golf course is a 25-year anniversary of this particular murder, and we will also see anniversary situations in many of the cases that I discovered after putting everything together and noting when the crimes took place and the writings took place. So this one on a golf course is a 25-year anniversary of the Zodiac Blue Rock Springs. So the areas that we're going to find a lot of bodies are going to be golf courses, rail yards, train tracks, waterways, and gravel pits. Will become a recognized dump site or killing sites for a lot of these people. The police in the White Rose Murders referred to the murderer as a deranged avenger who hated women and sought revenge on young women because they rejected him in his youth. If this is true, and a lot of these women appear to look like Jack's mother, then that would ring true to the perverse love that he had for her and that he was targeting women who looked most like her. The Avenger part of it, when they stated the deranged Avenger, we see that the Black Dahlia Avenger is used by the killer in the Elizabeth Shorts killer, which is a twist from one crime brought into another, which is another thing we'll be showing as a connection between one crime and the next crime through that connection that the killer wants us to find. I do have her family members at least listed. I did find, I'm not finding much because it's extremely old, but I did find a military connection to her family members where her father was a captain. I'm not sure in what type of military, but he was listed as a captain in the information. And her husband, Carl J. Kimball, was a sergeant at Camp McCain in Missouri. However, they were both stationed in Camp Callan, which we'll talk about as well. That brings us from LA back to the eastern states in South Carolina. The connection here is that I do find that when we ran his first wife's information, the private investigator found that she was from South Carolina. I do not know that Jack met her as early as the 1940s, although I do know that she is married to him by 1951 and has kids. So it did happen somewhere within the 1944 to the 1951 range, which is a short 7-year period. I believe they had 2, maybe 3 children in a picture. We'll see when we get there at that particular point in time, which means it was relatively close to 1944 that Jack met her. So on March 24th in 1944, we have the death of Mary Emma Thames and Betty June Binnicker. It's a water ditch near the railroad. So again, we have the waterway and the train in Alcaloo, South Carolina, which equals a Rhonda Michelle Blaylock in North Carolina in 1980. So we had some relation to South Carolina and North Carolina. These children were bludgeoned to death, which was basically what occurred with Ora Murray in Los Angeles. Binnicker was 11 years old and Thames was 8 years old, found in a water-filled ditch near the railroad track. The bodies were entangled and partially submerged with their bike on top of them. So we have a stacking of the bodies and the stacking of the bike. I think we'll see more of the stacking as we go along, and the wheel of the bike found nearby. So it had the ability to take the wheel off of the bike and leave it sitting. I don't believe they had the easy disconnect bike wheels at that time. So I'm going to guess that he must have had some type of a tool on him that would allow him to remove that tire. The body stacking is very similar to a Texas yogurt shop death, where when they came in, they found that the bodies had been stacked on each other after they had been killed. So at 7:30 a.m., a pair of scissors were discovered that Binnicker had taken to cut some flowers. Her father was, I believe, on the way home, and there was some type of event happening, and they were picking flowers for that event. Stinney's attorney is Charles Plowden. I attempted to make contact with this individual. Every time I did, the phone number just was busy, never rang through, never was able to actually make contact or get a hold of anybody. And this was actually a new news article or a magazine that I found sitting either at the doctor's office, chiropractor office, or my hair place. One of these three places, I always seem to come in and find a new unsolved murder from the early 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I would bring it home and put it into the presentation and see how it mapped itself out. Dr. R.F. Baker performed the postmortem examination, and our sheriff at the time was Earl Randall until 10/20 of 1969. So they went picking flowers because my dad was in the Army and he was coming home on furlough. So we have another military connection. Now, granted, in these days, everybody was in the military because that was your job as a citizen of the United States. The individual who was actually convicted of this crime was George Junius Stinney Jr., arrested and electrocuted for the crimes. Some of his background: George Stinney was born on October 21st, 1929, executed by electrocution on June 16th, 1944. They said that the 15-inch railroad spike was 20 pounds and that Stinney's 90 to 95-pound frame could not have wielded it to be able to kill the girls. And he should have been ruled out as a possible suspect. But we know with law enforcement back in the day, gosh, still today, they're happy to pin anything on a case that they can close, which is kind of scary. Again, I also tried to reach Matt Burgess, Charles Plowden, did not end up reaching anyone. In a cassette tape conversation between Dennis Kaufman and Jack Terrence in 2002, Jack said, "There are one or two of the situations that was not my fault, but I was responsible. That's a funny way to put it," he said. Dennis says, "I thought that being sent to Japan might have been one of the reasons for killing." Jack said, "I was killing before I went to Japan." Well, Jack went to Japan in 1945. I'm putting up that these cases should be looked at for Jack. Jack also said, "When I was growing up as a young child, I was a loner and I was a hunter. I spent a lot of time by myself. I lived in caves. It was a hell of a life." Dennis said, "Well, the main thing is you managed to stay free this whole time." And Jack stated, "That is true." So here we look at Alcaloosa, South Carolina in relation to Chicago, Illinois. While Jack claimed to have been traveling by the railway during this time frame and Flova had moved to Chicago, Illinois, this murder was done on the train tracks, with the suspect vanishing just like many of the other phantoms and ghosts in this series. I did start mapping at one point latitude and longitude to see how it played a role, because there definitely was some discussions about that in regards to radians and the use of Mount Diablo to map out those radians. So you're going to occasionally see where I actually mapped out the longitude and latitude to see if those numbers made any sense in regards to the crimes. So, I had already stated this. Jack's first wife, Letha, was showing having lived in South Carolina, and lo and behold, one of these addresses are within 40 miles of the murders listed above. So if, in fact, Jack had found Letha as early as 1944 in South Carolina, that would at least put him within the proximity of these particular murders. And maybe even Jack had taken a train to meet up with her. Maybe he'd met her at an earlier point. We just really don't have a lot of that information at this time, but it is another proximity. Then we move on to our second California murder, Wednesday, October 12th, 1944. Georgette Bauerdorf was found dead in her home in Hollywood, California. She was 20 years old and she was an oil heiress. So now we start to see some of the play on the oil. So a maid found her body face down in a bathtub. So again, the washing of the body after apparently being followed home from the Hollywood Servicemen's Club. It is believed that she was attacked by a man who was lying in wait for her. Los Angeles Sheriff's Inspector William Penpraise said that an automatic nightlight over the outside entrance of the apartment had been unscrewed 2 turns so it wouldn't go on. The murderer was thought to have stood on a chair to reach the light bulb nearly 8 feet from the floor, and fingerprints were found on the bulb. Now, to remove a light bulb, you would have to use a thumb. That's why we are human with opposable thumbs. We would actually probably then have a thumbprint, or a right thumbprint would be my thought, because Jack was primarily right-handed, but very much ambidextrous. Would have likely have used his right hand to unscrew that bulb. And if they do have a fingerprint still on file, unfortunately, a lot of these cases, all this information has come up missing, or they can't find it, which I think is rather fortuitous for never being able to close this case if that's the intentions. There's supposedly handwriting to the police from the suspect. I've not seen this handwriting, but I would be very interested in having it presented. These cases are so old, I don't even know why they continue to sit on the information as if they plan on solving it, when most of them will clearly tell you to your face they are not expending any more resources to get involved. Fine, then release the information to the public, because somebody may be able to work with that information, like myself. The theory of someone lying in wait was reinforced by an empty string bean can and some melon rinds found by the officers in the kitchen wastebasket. The investigators think Bauerdorf may have eaten a snack before retiring upstairs to her bedroom, and an examination of her stomach revealed that she had eaten string beans about an hour before her death, though it did not indicate whether or not there was any melon found in her stomach. Bauerdorf's jewelry and other valuables were not stolen, so this clearly was not a robbery. Although almost $100 was taken from her purse, there was a large roll of $2 bills and thousands of dollars worth of sterling silver lying in an open trunk. Her father was George Bauerdorf of Elko, Nevada, an oil magnate. Georgette volunteered at the Hollywood Canteen, where she was last seen with Elizabeth Short, where Elizabeth Short frequented. It was built by Betty Davis, John Garfield, and other Hollywood luminaries, and almost all movie stars donated their time. Georgette worked for the Women's Service Bureau at the Los Angeles Times. I don't know if this is the preempting of writing to the media, the fact that she was working for the Los Angeles Times, and our first communication is actually sent to the Los Angeles Times. A Pontiac 1936 coupe registered in the name of her sister, Connie Bauerdorf, was missing. When the car was located, there was a dent in one of the fenders. Mechanics said the damage was recent and may have been the result of a collision with another car. The Pontiac was discovered abandoned on East 25th Street, just off of San Pedro Street in Los Angeles, California, where it apparently ran out of gas. Bauerdorf put up a great struggle. An examination by Los Angeles County autopsy surgeon Frank R. Webb found an abundance of bruises and scrapes. The knuckles on Bauerdorf's right hand were smashed and bruised. Now, smashing of hands seems like such a mob thing to do. I don't understand why, if somebody was wanting to merely kill this woman just for kicks, as most serial killers are doing to satisfy some personal thing for themselves, why one would go through doing what it appears as though they were attempting to get information out of someone for. So that smashing of the knuckles and hands kind of sent a red flag up in my head. It wasn't typically found in many of the other deaths, which may lead to the fact that this particular individual was a hit or a requested murder, either to character assassinate her father, cause her father some type of grief, maybe take him out of the game. I'm not sure. But again, that was very striking. There was also a large bruise on the right side of her head and another on her abdomen. So clearly she was beaten before she was strangled. She had been strangled with a piece of towel that was stuffed down her throat. Webb said her right thigh showed a bruised imprint of a hand, even to the fingernail marks piercing the skin. So the individual was extremely aggressive with her, aside from wanting to kill her. A 9-inch by 9-inch elastic bandage shoved down her throat caused her death of asphyxiation. The tape that is used in the lipstick killings, gaffer's tape used in JonBenet Ramsey. We will see a continuing use of tape. Bob Lord was running from San Diego to New Orleans. Sister Constance married to A. Carroll Cartwright, who was an FBI agent in the 1940s. We have a law enforcement connection, and we have the suspect that's lying in wait, kind of like the JonBenet Ramsey case. The Los Angeles Times brings us back to Zodiac, Red Lipstick Killer, Red Phantom, Zodiac, Atlanta, Georgia, Child Killer, and more that wrote to the LA Times. I'm just following the money at this point. Again, found half nude in the bathtub. Upcoming killings that are next, we're going to see the use of a tub again. Some other side notes. The day before her death, she cashed a $175 check and purchased an airline ticket to El Paso, Texas for $90. She told friends that she was going there to rendezvous with her soldier boyfriend, another military connection. On October 11th, Private Jerome M. Brown, an anti-aircraft artillery trainee from Chicago, Illinois, bringing us back to Chicago, was identified by Fort Bliss authorities as the man Bauerdorf was going to visit before she was slain. Brown told Army officials he met Bauerdorf at the Hollywood Canteen on the night of June 13th. He left California a few days afterwards and arrived in El Paso some days after their meeting. I bring up El Paso simply because we're going to see El Paso once again once we moved into the lipstick killings. I did some checking in books that may have identified addresses and places for the Bauerdorf family. So the only thing I really could come up for George Bauerdorf was that he was an attorney and he was the treasurer and director of Georgette Hat Company, which may very well have been Georgette's business. I'm not sure again. So the information is being ascertained to determine if Bauerdorf or her father was the intended target of this hit and who else may have been connected. Military, oil, steel, media magnets are a theme through this presentation as well. So the killer obviously didn't have a car, or I don't think he would have fled the scene in Bauerdorf's car that she had borrowed from her sister. But I did map out the distance, and it appears as though it was 10 miles from Bauerdorf's house to where the car had ran out of gas and was found abandoned. I'm not sure where the person thought they were going at that point, but they were definitely on foot afterwards. February 6th of 1945. Jack is now 17 years old. At approximately this time or sometime close after, it said that Jack attempted to enter the military, but he was told to go gain some weight. We can see this picture to the left. He's a very skinny individual. And then we look to the picture on the right and we see almost a completely different hairstyle even. Jack seemed to appear almost differently, and we'll see some of the collections of his pictures through the years and how different he looks from one stage to the next. But I believe this is when Jack actually went back home to mom in Chicago, Illinois, and we see the continuance of a serial killer who likes to write and taunt the police. And it may be just a coincidence, but Doris Puckett, who's in the middle there, looks a whole heck of a lot like Jack's girlfriend in the picture to the right. Doris was a friend of Bauerdorf's, which is the murder we just discussed, and frequented the Hollywood Canteen as Elizabeth Short did. Palm tree background in the picture on the right usually screams LA or Florida, but I'm not really ready to commit. It does look like it's a picture that Jack has reproduced, which we'll talk about his ability with photography as we go as well. All right, so we have some military records here, which when I requested Jack's military records from the FBI, I was told that they had burnt up in a fire in 1970-71, which I believe housed mostly Army files, knowing that Jack's been through 3 militaries and that his jacket would have finally succumbed to a resting place where he, with the military he last served with, meant that it would have ended up in Air Force filing cabinets, not in Army. I had already read about this particular fire and what type of files it consumed before the FBI indicated that his was lost to the fire. I still made continuous attempts to try and get a hold of it, regardless of what the FBI said. And after 3 private investigators that I've worked with, one was actually able to obtain a portion of the file. It is my intentions to ask Jack's son, Charles, to make this FOIA request himself, see if he can't come up with more information from the file than we were able to, since it's limited to the public. What we were able to find is that Jack actually enlisted at 17 years and 4 months old in Lubbock, Texas. So here we have him back in Texas, where he is then put into the U.S. Navy Reserves from 6/2 of 1945 to 12/11 of 1945 was this particular stint. So he literally was in the military for 6 months before he was released. The 1942 Lubbock Army Air Corps Advanced Flying School is the base where I believe he actually enlisted, and we can see that picture to the left. The record shows that Jack enlisting on June 2nd, 1945. However, he was placed on a reserve status in Dallas, Texas. So he was not called into action, and he was not sent away for boot camp at this particular point in time. He had he had a month or so to be able to get his affairs in order. And at this point in time, I believe he went back home. Tell mom, I'm going to the military, and say goodbye. This would be a natural thing for Jack to do. And that would put him literally back into Chicago, Illinois during the next murder. Now, when I had reviewed and examined the lipstick killer's handwriting, the first thing Dennis told me is there's no way Jack would never have been in Chicago, that you're tying too many things together here. In fact, this was the first crime spree I'd ever tied to the Zodiac, because I instinctively knew that there was a beginning for this individual. And during that time frame, Dennis was fairly against me even researching any other murders, because he just wanted to focus on the Zodiac killings. And that was based on the fact that Chris Hopkins from the FBI indicated we really need to only close one case on him, and it makes all the others plausible. Well, this is where everything got really interesting. In March of 2010, while I was going through Jack's belongings, we found pictures of the Public Company of Northern Illinois. And we can see the background of this particular company, the parking lot, smokestacks. I identified the handwriting from the lipstick killing in September of 2009. There'd been no evidence until these pictures popped up to suggest that Jack was even in Chicago, until a review of his military career suggested that it was possible. So not only would there be training back east in Chicago and Michigan, there were other avenues in which Jack could have been in the Chicago area. And then we talked to a family member who had indicated that Jack's mother had in fact sold the farm in Texas and moved to Chicago, Illinois in 1944. Plus, I found that they also had family in Michigan and Chicago as well. So everything was a possibility at this point. And even though I asked the FBI to look up to see where his mother was during 1944, I was explained by the FBI that just because the handwriting matches doesn't mean that Jack was in Chicago, or that I couldn't place Jack in Chicago. Clearly, that occurred before we found these pictures, and we found out that Jack's mother had moved to Chicago. However, it just kind of solidified what my inclination was, is that this handwriting was in fact from Jack. So this particular public service company of Northern Illinois was the former Waukegan power plant. So we have our first introduction of power plants into this case. 1 mile from Waukegan and 36 miles from Edgewater, where the first 2 women were killed, and where the lipstick killings began. There are a couple of locations where Jack may have met his handlers, and this is one of them, since his first political outcry happens in this crime. However, Los Angeles has a strong connection to Chicago as well, and our first oil magnate is hit there. So there may be an outcry in the handwriting, but the handwriting has not been released in this case either, with the exception of a couple pieces, or I'm sorry, in the Bauerdorf case, it has not been released. Looks like we are pretty much about out of time. This particular slide is going to take a little bit more than 1 minute. So at this point, I would like to, say goodbye to everybody, let you know we are going to pick back up, beginning with information I also found in Jack's belongings in regards to another connection to the lipstick killing in the Chicago area. And that will be something new for next week. So without holding everybody up, I really appreciate your time. And I look forward to covering the lipstick killings, because I believe that's where we start to see our first ciphered or anagrammed ciphered message, where everybody's going to start to see how all of this stuff folds itself together into one neat little person who is literally the most prolific killer of our nation's history. Oh,